Walter Briggs didn't need an alarm clock. His body, worn by time and war, woke him precisely at 6 a.m. every Thursday like it had for the last 12 years. It was the day he took the long walk to Pete's Corner Deli, the one place in town where the coffee tasted like it still cared and the bread reminded him of home. He'd shuffle along the cracked sidewalks in his scuffed boots, the same pair issued to him during his final tour, soles worn nearly flat but still gripping the pavement like they had a mission to finish. His jacket, an old army issue from 1983, was patched in both elbows and stained from winters past, but he wore it proudly. The faded name tag on the chest still read, W. B. Briggs, and to Walter, it was less a piece of fabric and more a silent declaration, I was here. I mattered. The townspeople passed him like fog in the morning, noticed, maybe, but never seen. Sometimes he'd catch the glance of a teenager, quickly averted, or a tired mother too preoccupied with her screaming child to look up. The world moved too fast now, too distracted, too uninterested in the quiet shadows of men like him. Walter didn't mind. Not exactly. But every Thursday, he walked that route not only for bread and coffee, but for proof he still existed in the world that had once depended on him. In his mind, every step was an act of resistance, of persistence. He walked because he could. He walked because some of his friends never got to. This morning was colder than most. Frost etched delicate spiderwebs across the deli's front window, and Walter's breath hung in the air like ghostly ribbons. He tugged his collar higher, one gloved hand gripping the worn handle of his metal cane. His knees ached from the damp, and his hip groaned in protest, but he walked anyway, counting his steps like silent prayers. At the deli, Pete greeted him with a nod and slid the paper bag across the counter, fresh bread, a pack of cough drops, and a postcard with a photo of the Washington Monument, which Walter had asked for last week to send to his grandson at West Point. Walter tucked the bag under his arm and pushed the door open with his shoulder. The bell chimed behind him, soft and nostalgic. Across the street, laughter erupted. He turned to see a cluster of bikers outside Rosie's bar, their gleaming motorcycles lined up like trophies. They leaned against their machines, big men in leather jackets and mirrored sunglasses, smoke curling from cigarettes and mouths. The air pulsed with bass from the bar's speakers and the sour tang of beer. Walter didn't fear noise. He'd spent years in places where silence was the true danger, where quiet meant an ambush or a roadside mine. He wasn't intimidated by loud voices or polished chrome. He simply angled his cane forward and started crossing, head bowed slightly against the wind. As he passed the row of bikes, his coat brushed a handlebar, barely a graze. The motorcycle wobbled, but didn't tip. Walter stopped immediately, turned back, and raised both hands slightly. Didn't mean to touch it, son, he said in his deep, gravel-thick voice. Jacket's bulkier than it looks. It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't defiance. It was an honest apology from a man who knew the value of respect. But one of the bikers, tall, broad, and drunk on ego, stepped forward. His sunglasses glinted in the weak sunlight. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check his bike. He just slapped Walter across the face with an open hand that cracked through the cold air like gunfire. Walter's knees buckled and he went down hard, his hip striking pavement, the paper bag tearing beneath him. The loaf of bread rolled into the gutter. The cough drops scattered like loose shrapnel. The postcard fluttered beneath a parked car. The crowd at the bar laughed. One man turned away, another raised a drink. Nobody moved toward him. Nobody reached out. Walter lay still for a moment, blinking up at the overcast sky, the bite of winter settling into his bones. His cheek throbbed where the slap had landed, a warmth blooming beneath the skin. He didn't curse. He didn't cry. Instead, he slowly rolled onto his side, one hand searching for the bread, then the cane. He sat up on the curb, hunched, hands trembling not from age but from the silent weight of being seen and ignored. Back in 1970, outside Hue, Vietnam, Walter had pulled 3 men from a burning jeep while bullets split the air around him. He'd carried their screams in his head for years, each one louder than the slap he'd just received. But this silence, this crowd that pretended not to see him, heard in a place even war couldn't reach. He picked up the loaf of bread, now dusty and speckled with oil, and placed it gently back in the torn bag. The cough drops he let be. His cane had rolled several feet away, so he leaned forward and grunted, scooping it back with slow, practiced movements. He pushed himself up, using the bus bench nearby for leverage, and sat down with a soft exhale that misted in front of him like fog. He dabbed the corner of his lip with his sleeve, wiping away a small trace of blood. A teenager walked by, earbuds in, hoodie pulled tight. Walter raised a hand just slightly, instinctive. The boy didn't see. Or maybe he did, and just kept walking. It didn't matter. Walter had learned long ago not to expect rescue from those who didn't even recognize a man who once stood in the path of chaos for strangers. He reached into his coat pocket, feeling past his wallet and the postcard's edge until his fingers found the worn plastic of an old flip phone. The screen was cracked, buttons faded, but it still worked. He flipped it open and scrolled down to a single name in the contacts list, Eagle 6. He pressed the button, held it for 2 seconds, then released. The call didn't connect. It didn't have to. Walter clicked the phone shut, tucked it away, and leaned back on the bench, eyes closed for a moment. The street moved around him as if he were invisible. As if nothing had happened. As if an old black man in an army jacket hadn't just been struck down in front of them. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He was waiting. Because they didn't know who he was. But someone did. And someone was already on the way. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Main Street never looked dangerous. It had flower pots on every corner, a barbershop that still used a striped pole, and lampposts that glowed warm yellow at night. It was the kind of town that made people assume nothing ever happened, where trouble wore polite faces and smiled through its teeth. Walter Briggs knew better. He'd lived too long, seen too much, to be fooled by paint and sidewalks. Still, even he didn't expect that today, a morning that began like every other Thursday, would change the entire town's memory of itself. As he sat on the bench outside the deli, the sting of the slap still fresh on his face and his breath shallow from both the cold and the insult, Walter looked across the street again. The biker stood with his back to him now, arms crossed and body loose with the confidence of a man who didn't fear consequence. He wore a sleeveless leather vest, tattoos running down both arms like battle flags. His friends, a group of 5 or 6, laughed and passed a cigarette among themselves, throwing their heads back and tipping bottles to their lips like nothing had just happened. The bar's door swung open every few seconds as music spilled out and mixed with the hum of traffic. Rosie's bar had been there since before Walter returned from his second tour. It was a place where veterans sometimes gathered in the old days, but that time was long gone. Now, it belonged to the loudest voices, not the strongest character. He remembered when it was a place where men talked about the weight of silence, not the volume of the bass. Walter shifted slightly on the bench, his knee stiff and unforgiving. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since his last day in uniform, when he buried a friend in the red clay soil of a country he never wanted to see again. But this pain wasn't physical. It was something deeper, a fracture that echoed through memory and pride. That slap wasn't just about today. It was about every time someone passed him like he wasn't there, every time his medals gathered dust in the drawer instead of respect in a glance. He looked down at his hands, thick-knuckled and veined like old rope, resting on top of his cane. Those hands had fixed tank engines in the Kuwaiti heat, had lifted wounded soldiers out of burning wreckage, had written trembling letters to a wife who had long since passed. And now, those hands trembled not from fear, but from the effort of holding back everything they wanted to say. Across the street, the biker reenacted the slap for his friends, mimicking Walter's slow fall to the sidewalk. One of them howled with laughter. Walter felt a fresh wave of heat rise under his collar, not from the cold, but from humiliation. He turned his head slightly, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing his reaction. A man at a bus stop a few feet away gave him a quick glance, then looked down at his phone. A woman with 2 children walked by, her eyes darting to the biker, then to Walter, and then quickly away, pretending she saw nothing. No one asked if he was okay. No one even offered a tissue for the blood still caking faintly at the corner of his mouth. He was invisible again. Just an old black man in a military jacket no one recognized. The bag with the bread lay beside him, resting on the bench like a wounded animal. He could feel the crushed loaf through the paper, still warm but misshapen. He reached inside gently, straightening it with trembling care as though it still mattered. It did matter. Because it was a reminder that he was here, and he had come for something. He wouldn't let one man, one coward, take that from him. Not today. The phone in his pocket remained silent. That was expected. The call he made wasn't one that demanded a response. It was a signal. A flare from one soldier to another. A code spoken without words, one that only those who had lived through the same fire would understand. Walter didn't have many left in his unit, but the one who mattered most had always promised that when the time came, he'd show up. No questions. No hesitation. He leaned back slowly, breathing in the chill, letting it fill his lungs with something steadier than rage. He didn't want vengeance. He wanted accountability. Not just for him, but for every man like him who'd been pushed aside when their usefulness expired. He was done letting the world pretend that dignity aged out. Across the street, the biker swaggered toward his motorcycle, kicking the kickstand and checking the handlebars with exaggerated care, muttering something to his crew that Walter couldn't hear but understood all the same. Mockery was a language you didn't need to be fluent in to recognize. A young waitress peeked out from Rosie's window, caught Walter's eye for a half-second, then quickly ducked back inside. Even the bartender, who had probably seen the whole thing, hadn't bothered to cross the street. Walter was not surprised. Indifference was a learned instinct in a town like this. People kept their heads down and pretended virtue lived only in politics and parades. Walter knew different. He had lived among men who were brave when no one was watching. He had buried them. Prayed for them. Remembered their names long after the world forgot. That's what hurt most. Not the slap. Not the blood. But the silence. The communal choice to turn away. He watched the sky. Clouds drifted low and heavy, gray with a promise of late snow. There was a sound just on the edge of hearing, something distant, barely present, like thunder far away or the memory of it. Walter blinked. Not yet, he thought. But soon. He wasn't waiting for justice to arrive in sirens and courtroom apologies. He wasn't waiting for anyone to say sorry. He was waiting for something older than that. He was waiting for the world to remember what it owed. Not to him alone, but to all who had stood when others ran. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened again. Somewhere, just beyond the edge of town, something stirred. The air around Walter Briggs still trembled from the echo of that slap. It had not come with warning, not with a shout or push, just a sudden, open-handed strike that cracked across his weathered face and snapped his balance like a brittle twig. The world had stilled in that instant, as if even time itself had paused to decide whether to care. His body, aged and loyal to gravity, obeyed the laws of pain. He crumpled to the sidewalk, his left knee striking the concrete first, followed by his shoulder and then his hip. The bag in his arm tore apart on impact, the bread spilling like wounded pride into the gutter, cough drops bouncing and scattering beneath rusted cars. The postcard to his grandson floated in the air for a moment, catching wind like a paper flag before disappearing under a nearby tire. For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Not the silence of awe, but the silence of discomfort, of people choosing not to see what their eyes had just absorbed. Inside Rosie's bar, the music kept playing. The bartender glanced up, then returned to drying a glass. A woman behind him chuckled softly, mistaking the commotion for a clumsy stumble. Outside, one of the bikers barked a laugh, taking a long drag of his cigarette. Another leaned in toward the man who had struck Walter and said something that made them both snicker. No one crossed the street. No one rushed to help the old black man now struggling to sit upright on a sidewalk that had never been so cold or unforgiving. Walter didn't cry out. That was not in his nature. He had learned long ago that some pain earned no sympathy, and some wounds had to be carried alone. Instead, he pressed his palm against the sidewalk, trying to lift himself without showing the strain in his back or the tremor in his legs. His cane had rolled several feet away, out of reach. His hands, once strong enough to lift engines from armored trucks in deserts far from home, now trembled as they tried to push his weight off the ground. He felt the skin on his palms scrape against the cement, but he welcomed the sting. It was real. It told him he was still here. As he finally managed to sit upright, Walter's vision steadied, and he looked around. His eyes scanned the street not in desperation but in quiet disappointment. A woman walked by with a stroller, her face frozen in that strange expression people wear when they pretend not to notice suffering. A man at the corner store leaned against the wall, tapping his phone, stealing glances before returning to the safe world of digital distraction. The street, dressed in its usual morning calm, had just witnessed a man be struck down in daylight, and all it had offered in return was indifference. Walter's cheek burned from the blow. His lip was split, the taste of copper sharp in his mouth. He dabbed at it with the sleeve of his jacket and then noticed the bread lying beside him. It was dented, a little soiled, but still intact. He picked it up and gently slipped it back into the torn paper bag, as if restoring some sense of order would reclaim a piece of his dignity. Then he reached for the postcard. It had landed face down beneath the tire of a parked pickup truck. He shuffled on his knees and stretched slowly, groaning under his breath until his fingers grasped the corner. He pulled it out, wiped off the dirt, and looked at it for a long moment. His grandson's name was already written on the back in cursive that trembled from years of arthritis but held steady meaning. He tucked it into his coat pocket, next to his heart. The biker who had struck him was now back to entertaining his friends. He was reliving the moment like a story at a bar, pantomiming Walter's stumble, then mocking the apology that had preceded it. "My jacket's thicker than I thought," he said in a drawl, then slapped the air in front of him, roaring with laughter. His friends slapped his back. No one questioned him. No one chastised him. In their world, Walter was nobody, a tired figure in a faded uniform, too old to matter and too polite to fight back. Walter finally stood, using the bench behind him for support. His knees crackled in protest, his hip throbbed, and his spine screamed with each inch upward. But he did it without a sound. Pride wasn't about standing tall when the world applauded, it was about standing at all when the world didn't. He retrieved his cane, tested his footing, and sat down again. This time, not because he was weak, but because he needed to think. He remembered once during training, a drill sergeant had told him that real strength wasn't in how hard you could hit, but in how long you could hold your ground after being hit. Back then, Walter had nodded, young and idealistic, not yet tested by fire or time. But today, the words returned with greater meaning than ever. His ground wasn't sand or jungle anymore, it was this sidewalk. This town. This moment. He pulled out the phone. It was old and scratched, the kind of flip phone no one used anymore, except men like him. Men who didn't need fancy apps, just reliable connections. He scrolled to the one contact saved inside, Eagle 6. He pressed the button and let the call ring once before canceling it. He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't expect one. The signal had been sent. A message far louder than any plea for help. He looked up at the sky. The clouds were thickening, and the wind had shifted. There was a stillness in the air that felt out of place for a Thursday morning. Walter didn't know when or how, but he believed in his bones that something was coming. Not revenge, he didn't care for that, but recognition. Accountability. Something more powerful than fists or slaps. Something earned, not demanded. He exhaled slowly, the breath curling in front of him like smoke, and fixed his eyes on the biker across the street. The man hadn't looked his way since the incident, confident that the moment had passed and the world had moved on. But Walter knew better. He had seen too much to believe that anything this ugly stayed buried forever. He leaned back on the bench, placed both hands on his cane, and sat perfectly still. He looked like an old man waiting for a bus. But deep inside, he was a soldier waiting for a signal, a father waiting for his son, and a forgotten hero waiting for a town to remember. Walter sat motionless on the bench as the cold worked its way deeper into his joints. The sun remained hidden behind thick clouds that hung low over Main Street, casting a gray pall over everything. His breath puffed out in slow clouds, each one dissipating into the still air. His cheek still ached where the slap had landed, the skin warm and tight where blood had dried and crusted at the corner of his mouth. He didn't bother to wipe it again. He didn't want to erase the evidence. He wanted the world to see it, if only it would bother to look. Around him, life carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed lazily, tires hissing on wet pavement. A delivery truck idled outside the diner, the driver focused on his phone as he leaned against the hood. From the alley behind Rosie's bar, the mechanical whine of a beer keg dolly echoed faintly. Even the pigeons pecked at the breadcrumbs near Walter's feet without urgency. The slap, the fall, the shame. All of it had already dissolved into the background noise of a town that specialized in forgetting. Walter adjusted his jacket and folded his hands over the top of his cane. He could still feel the imprint of the biker's hand across his face. The burn of it had settled into his bones, into the same places that remembered the heat of battle and the weight of fallen comrades. His body knew violence, but this was different. This was a violence of erasure, the kind that told a man he no longer mattered. He had once been a name stitched on a uniform, a trusted hand on the engine of a stalled Humvee, a voice that steadied younger men in chaos. And now he was a body on a bench, his identity blurred by time and silence. He watched as the biker leaned against his motorcycle and struck a match with his thumb. He lit another cigarette, exhaling a long plume of smoke into the air like he was proud of what he'd done. His friends laughed again, nudging each other as they took long drinks from their bottles. Walter recognized that laugh. It was the laugh of cowards who had never stood for anything except themselves. A waitress from the diner glanced out the window at him. Their eyes met for a brief second before she quickly turned away. She disappeared behind the curtain like a ghost embarrassed to be seen. Walter didn't blame her. This wasn't the kind of thing people wanted to get involved in. They told themselves it wasn't their business, that someone else would step in, that silence was safety. But he had lived long enough to know the truth. Silence was surrender. He shifted slightly, trying to ease the ache in his hip. The pain was constant now, a dull throb that reminded him of old injuries and forgotten nights on foreign soil. He had learned to live with discomfort, to let it walk beside him like an old friend. But what he couldn't accept was the invisibility. A young man crossed the street nearby, his hoodie up, earbuds in, walking fast. Walter raised a hand slowly, not to wave, just to be acknowledged. The boy didn't even turn his head. Another figure, an older man with a shopping bag, glanced at him once, then looked away with the practiced indifference of someone determined not to become involved. Walter lowered his hand and let it rest on his knee. The wind shifted slightly, lifting the edge of the paper bag beside him. He looked down at the bread inside. It was crushed and soiled, but he still planned to eat it. It wasn't about the food. It was about the act of not letting anything go to waste, not his bread, not his pain, not his moment. He thought of the postcard. His grandson, Marcus, would be heading into his final semester at West Point soon. Walter had written a short message on the back in his careful, shaky handwriting, "Proud of you. Make them see you." That was all. No lectures. No war stories. Just 6 words that carried a lifetime of weight. He reached into his coat and pulled it out again, running his thumb along the bent edge. It was dirty now, but Marcus wouldn't mind. The boy understood that not everything needed to be clean to be honorable. Walter exhaled slowly and looked back at the bar. The biker was pacing now, still relishing in his moment. He slapped the shoulder of one of his friends, then mimicked Walter's fall again, bending his knees and dropping low with theatrical exaggeration. More laughter followed. Walter's jaw tightened. It wasn't rage. It was something deeper, an old hurt that came from knowing the world would let that man walk away with pride intact. He had been called many things in his life: soldier, sergeant, father, widower. But never had he felt so near to being called worthless, even if no one dared to say the word aloud. Behind his stoicism, behind the stillness of his body and the silence of his mouth, Walter's mind burned with clarity. He hadn't come here looking for trouble. He had only wanted to walk, to pick up bread, to send love to a grandson. But trouble had found him anyway. And now he had sent a signal. He didn't know how long it would take. But someone was coming. Not because he couldn't defend himself. Not because he wanted rescue. But because someone had promised him, a long time ago, that if the world ever forgot what he was worth, they would remind it. The clouds above began to shift. The air carried a new weight, like the town had taken a breath and was holding it. Walter didn't move. He let his cane rest gently against his knee and closed his eyes for a moment. He wasn't planning revenge. He wasn't imagining punishment. He was remembering the names of men who never got the chance to grow old, who never sat on benches because their lives had ended in deserts and jungles and foreign towns that couldn't pronounce their names. He owed them this moment. To sit. To be seen. To not disappear quietly. Somewhere beyond the edges of Main Street, past the suburbs and the farmland and the radio towers that dotted the hills, there was a low hum beginning to rise. It was subtle, still distant, but steady. Walter's ears, aged though they were, picked up on it. Not with his hearing, but with the part of him that had once crouched in dust and listened for danger in the silence. He felt it coming before he heard it clearly, before anyone else on the street had reason to look up. He opened his eyes and looked at the horizon. The wait was almost over. Walter remained perfectly still, his hands folded neatly over the head of his cane, his breathing slow and steady as if he were saving energy for something important. Around him, the town buzzed along in its usual rhythm, oblivious to the moment that had just reshaped its soul. People came and went from the diner behind him, their conversations light, hollow, the clinking of silverware against plates mingling with the hiss of a distant espresso machine. Life hadn't paused for what happened to him. It rarely did for men like Walter. But Walter wasn't waiting for life to notice. He had sent the signal. He shifted slightly, feeling the pressure in his lower back from the fall, the dull stiffness in his knees worsening by the minute. A younger man would have stood up and paced, maybe barked at the biker, maybe confronted the bartender, demanded justice, demanded attention. But Walter had learned long ago that real power didn't always come with volume. Sometimes it came from quiet endurance, from stillness in the face of wrong. That was the strength drilled into him as a mechanic under fire, in the blinding heat of the Gulf, in the deafening silence of Kosovo nights. It wasn't flashy. It was steady. Reliable. Like him. He could still hear the voice of his commanding officer from decades ago, thick with Georgia drawl and cigarette smoke, repeating the same phrase over and over: "When you call Eagle 6, it better mean something." That phrase had never left Walter. It wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a threat. It was a vow. You didn't press that number unless you had a damn good reason. Not a scrape. Not a dispute. Not even a busted rib. No, Eagle 6 was for something sacred, something a man couldn't walk away from, not because of injury, but because of principle. And today, when Walter had pressed that single button on his battered flip phone, it hadn't been because he was hurt. It was because something deeper had been broken. His dignity had been stepped on, not just by the biker, but by everyone who watched and stayed silent. As he waited, Walter closed his eyes for a moment and let memory flood through him like slow water over stone. He saw his wife's smile as she handed him the very jacket he now wore, freshly stitched and still stiff from the warehouse. He heard her voice telling him to stay sharp before every deployment, the edge of worry behind her calm. He saw his son, then just a boy, standing on the front porch with a plastic army helmet and saluting so fiercely it made Walter's chest ache. He had spent his life serving others, fixing what was broken, lifting others up. He had done so without ever needing to be thanked. But today wasn't just about him. It was about every man who had ever worn the uniform and been forgotten the moment he took it off. Across the street, the biker was finishing his cigarette. He flicked the butt into the street and kicked at a small pebble on the pavement. He was getting bored. Maybe thinking about getting on his bike and riding off. Maybe wondering if there would be another laugh to squeeze from his audience before the bar called last round on the afternoon. He didn't look back at Walter. Why would he? In his mind, he'd won. He had made his point with that slap. He had proved that the old man on the sidewalk didn't matter. That there would be no consequences. Walter didn't glance his way. He didn't need to. He knew the kind of man the biker was. Loud on the outside, hollow on the inside. The kind who mistook cruelty for confidence. Walter had met plenty of them over the years. Some of them wore uniforms once. Some didn't. But they all shared the same flaw: they underestimated what quiet men were capable of when pushed too far. A gust of wind swept down Main Street then, swirling dust and dry leaves into a small spiral at the corner. Walter's coat flapped gently around his thighs. The sky had darkened slightly, the sun fully buried behind thick, unmoving clouds. There was a strange feeling in the air, like something unseen had passed over the town and left it just a little colder. Walter felt it in his bones before he heard it. A deep, rhythmic pulse, a vibration more than a sound, beginning somewhere far away. His ears weren't what they used to be, but his instincts were as sharp as ever. He leaned forward slightly, tilting his head as if catching a faint melody beneath the hum of traffic. There it was again. That low, familiar thrum that stirred something ancient in his chest. No one else seemed to notice. Not yet. A woman walked by pushing a stroller, humming a lullaby. Two high school students exited the diner, laughing at something on their phones. A delivery driver cursed as he dropped a crate of soda cans, the metallic clatter drowning out everything for a moment. But Walter heard it, steady and growing. Not a truck. Not construction. It was deeper than that. It was coordinated, heavy, and deliberate. He looked toward the horizon, past the rooftops of the town, past the bar, and past the treetops that lined the distant fields. A flash of movement caught his eye. Then another. Shadows slicing the sky, fast and low. The sound thickened, deepened, and with it came the rush of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. He rose slowly from the bench, gripping his cane tighter now, not for support but for grounding. The vibration underfoot had reached the sidewalk. Small pebbles rattled against the curb. People were beginning to look up now, their expressions puzzled. The music from inside Rosie's bar faltered as someone turned it down. A waitress stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the wind. The biker glanced up, frowning. Something was coming. Something none of them expected. Walter stood tall despite the pain, his back straightening as the sound grew louder, more certain. The air pulsed. Then, cutting through the sky with the grace of a bird and the power of a storm, came the unmistakable silhouette of a Black Hawk helicopter. Its blades sliced the clouds like prophecy, and it descended lower than any commercial aircraft had a right to in a town this small. Windows trembled. Leaves scattered. Phones came out. Dogs barked from passing cars. Children stared wide-eyed, pointing. The Black Hawk dipped and began to circle. Walter didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stood there, unmoving, watching. The call had been received. The signal answered. And Main Street was about to remember that some men, even when seated quietly with a torn paper bag and a busted lip, still carried the weight of honor on their shoulders, and that honor, once disrespected, would not be left unanswered. The first sign something was different came in the form of vibrations, subtle at first, like the tremble of an old air conditioner unit or the aftershock of a distant train passing through unseen tracks. But it grew quickly. Walter Briggs felt it before most others did. It crawled up through the soles of his boots and reached deep into the marrow of his bones. The metal cane in his hand picked it up too, its tip buzzing slightly against the concrete beneath the bench. His eyes never left the sky. His breath stayed steady, controlled, waiting. He had heard this sound before. Many times in different lands and under different flags, but this time, it was coming home. The townsfolk noticed next. Heads turned slowly, eyebrows furrowed. Some cupped their hands over their brows to peer upward. A man stepped outside the bar, blinking into the shifting light. The bartender leaned into the doorway, drying his hands with a towel, the easy rhythm of the afternoon now broken by something larger than his usual routine. Inside the diner, forks paused halfway to mouths. Phones were drawn not out of fear, but curiosity. That sound didn't belong here, not in sleepy downtown, not on a Thursday afternoon. It wasn't the sound of police sirens or fire engines. It wasn't a crop duster making a pass. It was lower than that, heavier, full of purpose. A woman exiting the dry cleaners froze mid-step, one hand over her chest. The old mechanic at the corner shop looked up from under his car and let the wrench fall from his fingers. A child tugged on his mother's coat and asked, "Is that a plane?" But Walter knew better. It wasn't just a plane. It was a message. The clouds parted slightly as the Black Hawk descended from the sky like a hawk loosed from a storm. Its body was sleek and dark, matte black with markings only those trained to see would recognize. It did not hover lazily or circle with hesitation. It came in fast and low, like it belonged here, like it had been summoned for something sacred. The rotors carved into the air, slicing through the calm with a rhythmic thump that grew louder, more insistent. Dust lifted from the sidewalks. A gust of wind blasted through the bar's open door, scattering napkins and loose receipts. Trees lining the street bent slightly as the helicopter tilted into position, coming in over the empty field that bordered the edge of the block. There it paused, hovered, then began to descend with deliberate control. People began backing up instinctively. Cars slowed to a crawl, some stopping entirely. The biker looked up now, frowning. His bravado slipped for just a second, like a man trying to remember whether he'd forgotten to pay a tab. One of his buddies asked something, but he didn't answer. He just stared at the machine as it dropped lower, kicking up leaves and debris, its presence impossible to ignore. And then the second sign came, not from the air, but the road. A matte black SUV, sleek and window-tinted, barreled down Main Street from the opposite direction. It didn't weave through traffic. It didn't signal. It moved with the same certainty as the helicopter above, as though both were parts of the same living organism. The SUV skidded slightly as it halted directly in front of Rosie's bar. Its doors opened in perfect unison. Boots hit the pavement. Not with a rush, not with panic, but with purpose. 12 men emerged, dressed in tactical black. No shouting. No weapons raised. Just calm, efficient motion. Their eyes swept the street, scanning everything. Each one moved like they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, not in theory, but in memory. The crowd stepped back instinctively, unsure if they were witnessing a training exercise or the prelude to something they couldn't comprehend. Phones were raised now, but more slowly. No one was narrating. No one dared speak over what they were seeing. There was too much weight in the air. Too much history stirring awake. The men fanned out, forming a loose semicircle that spanned the bar's entrance and bled into the sidewalk. Behind them, the Black Hawk touched down with a controlled rumble, the last few feet easing into a hover before the landing gear kissed the earth. Dust kicked up in every direction. The blades continued to churn, the noise drowning out anything except the heartbeat pounding in Walter's ears. Then the side door of the helicopter slid open. A man stepped out. He wore no sunglasses. No helmet. No unnecessary gear. Just a uniform tailored with precision, adorned with subtle but unmistakable insignia. His shoulders were broad, his frame solid. His hair was short, flecked with gray at the temples. And though his boots struck the ground with force, it was the stillness in his eyes that commanded attention. He walked forward through the wind, untouched by it, his gaze locked on one figure. Walter. The older man did not rise. He remained seated on the bench, both hands still resting on his cane. But as the figure approached, Walter looked up, and the corners of his eyes tightened with emotion he would never voice aloud. The man didn't salute. He didn't speak until he reached the bench, then slowly bent down on one knee and whispered, just loud enough to be heard through the wind and the awe of onlookers. "Dad," he said softly, brushing a speck of blood from Walter's cheek with a thumb far more gentle than the hands trained for war. "I got here as fast as I could." The biker, now silent, turned toward the scene with eyes that finally betrayed uncertainty. He looked from the Black Hawk to the SUV to the kneeling man before Walter and then to the patch on the shoulder of the man's uniform. His mouth opened slightly. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply watched, slowly realizing that the man he'd struck was not just some old veteran, not just a name on a fading jacket, but someone with a unit. Someone with a son. Someone whose silence carried more force than his own noise ever could. Walter reached up and rested his hand on the man's shoulder, just for a second. He didn't need to say thank you. The bond between them, forged in blood and time, needed no words. Around them, the town stood still. Not frozen in fear. Not halted in confusion. But stopped by reverence. Because the sky had answered, and with it came a reminder, some men, even in their old age, are never truly alone. Some uniforms, even when packed away, are never truly removed. And dignity, once called into question, has a way of summoning back the full weight of memory and honor. Walter looked into his son's eyes, nodded once, then finally let himself breathe. Not because he was safe, but because the world had started to see him again. Main Street had never been this quiet, not even during the early days of the pandemic or the annual 4th of July ceremony when traffic was blocked off for parades and speeches. It was a stillness born not of confusion but of awe, like a congregation holding its breath before a sacred ritual. All eyes were locked on the figures in black who had emerged from the SUV, their movements precise, synchronized, and loaded with unspoken authority. They didn't speak. They didn't yell. They didn't have to. Every step they took was calculated, not in aggression, but in quiet confidence that needed no explanation. It was the kind of presence that made even the most defiant instinctively stand a little straighter. The 12 soldiers moved like one unit, their boots striking the pavement in soft, synchronized rhythm. No one outside Rosie's bar dared to interrupt. Patrons stood frozen in the doorway, and for the first time all day, the bikers weren't laughing. The largest of the group, the one who had slapped Walter, stood stiff now, his mouth partly open as if searching for a joke that had evaporated with the sound of spinning rotors. His hands were by his sides, knuckles taut, and a single bead of sweat glistened at his temple despite the cold. Commander Briggs rose from his crouch beside his father, his eyes cold and unreadable. He turned to face the street. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand in anger. He simply looked, and in that moment, the entire town seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his gaze. The soldiers behind him didn't move. They stood at ease, yet the tension in their posture was unmistakable. They were ready. Not for battle, but for clarity. For justice. Walter didn't speak either. He remained seated on the bench, his cane resting between his knees, his body still weathered and aching but filled with a quiet resolve that no slap could ever touch. He had done what he needed to do. The rest, now, was up to his son. Commander Briggs stepped forward, his boots echoing on the pavement. The biker, still holding on to whatever bravado he had left, flinched as Briggs approached, though the commander hadn't said a single word. Finally, Briggs stopped 10 feet in front of him and spoke in a voice low, calm, and deliberate, like a sermon meant only for those with ears willing to hear. "Which one of you struck a veteran?" The words weren't shouted, but they cut through the silence like a blade. No one answered at first. A few of the biker's friends took small steps back, as if distance might buy them anonymity. The man who had delivered the slap raised both hands slightly, his grin now gone, replaced by something more slippery, mock innocence. "It was just some old guy," he said with a shrug. "He bumped my bike. I didn't know who he was." Briggs didn't blink. He didn't flinch. His expression didn't shift. "That old man," he said slowly, "served this country while you were still learning how to spell your own name." There was a ripple in the crowd now, a low collective murmur that moved from person to person like a wave of regret catching up to the moment. A man near the crosswalk whispered something to his wife. Someone filming muttered, "Oh damn," under their breath. The biker tried to smirk again but failed. "You military types think you can roll in and make a show of everything," he said, though his voice cracked halfway through. "You think that means something out here?" Briggs took one step closer. Only one. But it was enough to close the distance between intimidation and reckoning. "I didn't come here to make a show," he said. "I came here because my father bled on a sidewalk while cowards stood around with their hands in their pockets." He turned slightly and raised a single finger toward one of his men. The soldier nodded, stepped back, and spoke quietly into a radio clip to his vest. Less than 2 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled into the intersection. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just the presence of accountability arriving in full view of the town that had failed to offer it earlier. The cruiser stopped beside the bar. 2 officers stepped out, not with swagger, but with caution. They had seen the footage already. Someone had forwarded it to dispatch. They understood. They didn't ask questions. They didn't debate. Briggs pointed directly at the biker. The man paled but didn't run. Where would he go? He raised his hands again, not in protest, but in surrender. The officers moved in, placed him in cuffs, and led him to the cruiser. No struggle. No shouting. Just the soft click of metal around wrists that had swung too freely 30 minutes ago. As the cruiser drove away, a strange quiet fell over the block. The wind returned, brushing against the benches and flicking dust into the air. Walter remained seated, his eyes now on the fading taillights. Commander Briggs returned to him, knelt once more, and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his voice lower now, touched by something softer. Walter nodded slowly, the gesture small but full. "I've had worse," he said with a faint smile. "Just not in front of so many people who did nothing." The words hung in the air. Raw. Unpolished. True. A woman stepped forward from the crowd. Gray streaks ran through her hair, her hands clutched tightly in front of her. She walked with hesitation, the kind born of guilt, not fear. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded handkerchief. "I should have said something," she murmured. "I'm sorry." Walter accepted the cloth gently, nodded once, then wiped his lip. It wasn't about the blood anymore. It was about being seen. Finally, slowly, others followed. A teenage boy took off his cap and placed it over his heart. A young father lifted his daughter onto his shoulders and pointed toward Walter like he was pointing to something sacred. A retired Navy man walked to the edge of the sidewalk and stood at attention. One by one, veterans stepped forward and formed a line, shoulder to shoulder, their eyes steady, their spines straight. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence said it all. The soldiers from the Black Hawk didn't interfere. They stood back and let the moment belong to Walter. Commander Briggs rose, stepped aside, and watched it unfold, his chest rising slowly, eyes flicking toward the heavens as if thanking something larger than himself. Walter sat a little taller now. Not out of pride, but out of relief. The world had paused. It had noticed. And in that moment, he knew that he had not waited in vain. Dignity, once restored, made silence impossible. There was a shift in the air, not just the wind, not just the drop in temperature from the rotor wash of the Black Hawk now idling behind the shops, but something deeper, something woven into the fabric of the street itself. People stood in stunned silence, not out of fear but reverence, the kind that wraps around you when something sacred happens unexpectedly. It wasn't just the arrest or the soldiers or the Black Hawk that silenced the town. It was the look on the face of Commander Briggs, the man who had stepped off that helicopter not with force but with purpose, the man who had knelt beside an old veteran like he was kneeling beside a king. He didn't move like a man trying to prove something. He moved like a man who already knew who he was. And more importantly, who his father was. Commander Briggs stood now at the center of the street, his uniform crisp even in the gust still kicking dust into the air. His jaw was square, tight, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd, not in judgment but in quiet assessment. There was no hatred in his stance. No revenge. Just command. People had stopped filming, not because the show was over, but because the moment had become too real to be watched through a screen. The veterans still stood shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalk, forming a silent tribute, a human wall of honor for a man who had once been invisible and was now impossible to ignore. A man stepped out from the crowd, hesitant. He was in his 60s, his flannel shirt tucked neatly into his jeans, the sleeves rolled up, revealing a faded navy tattoo on his forearm. He moved slowly, deliberately, until he stood a few feet away from Walter. Then he clicked his heels together and raised his hand in a firm salute. Walter looked up, nodded, and returned the gesture, though his fingers trembled slightly from age and emotion. That was enough. It cracked something open. Another man stepped forward, then another. A former Air Force mechanic. A retired Marine Corps cook. A National Guard medic. They came not as a show, but as a reckoning. Not for the town. For Walter. Commander Briggs watched in silence as the line of veterans grew, expanding until it reached the end of the block. Then he turned and walked slowly back to the bench where his father sat. Walter looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much in this world to be surprised anymore, but there was a quiet glint behind the exhaustion, a kind of gratitude that only comes from being recognized after too long in the shadows. "You didn't have to come like this," Walter said, his voice hoarse but steady. Briggs crouched beside him again, the same way he had before. "You pressed Eagle 6, he replied. "That was all I needed." Walter chuckled, and it came out rough, like gravel. "Didn't think you'd bring the whole unit." "I didn't," Briggs said, looking over his shoulder at the soldiers. "They volunteered." Walter raised an eyebrow. "All of them?" Briggs nodded. "The minute I said it was you. Some of them served under you in training rotations. Others knew your record. All of them respected it." He paused, then added more quietly, "More than this town ever did." Walter looked down for a moment, then out at the people gathered along the sidewalk. Some still looked uncertain, unsure of how to respond to what they'd witnessed. Others wore the expression of people realizing, too late, that they'd failed someone who never asked for anything but respect. A few had tears in their eyes. Walter didn't want tears. He wanted truth. "Son," he said, "this isn't just about me." "I know," Briggs replied. "It's about every man like you who got pushed aside when his service ended." Walter didn't speak for a moment. The weight of the years sat heavy in his chest. "I just wanted bread and a cup of coffee." "And you got a Black Hawk and national attention," Briggs said, managing the faintest smile. Walter didn't smile back. "I got hit," he said. "By a boy who didn't care who I was. And by a town that still doesn't know how to look a veteran in the eye unless he's wearing medals and standing in a parade." Briggs didn't answer. He didn't need to. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Walter took it carefully. It was a list. Names. Units. Citations. Stories of other veterans, some from this very town, who had also been disrespected, ignored, discarded. Briggs had compiled them over years. Not for revenge. For reckoning. Walter stared at the paper for a long moment, then looked up. "What do you want me to do with this?" "Tell their stories," Briggs said. "Or let me help you tell yours." Walter folded the paper and slid it into his coat. "It's not about stories," he said. "It's about memory." "I know," Briggs replied. "But memory needs a voice." For a moment, the two men sat in silence, surrounded by the murmur of the crowd, the soft rustle of leaves stirred by the still spinning blades of the Black Hawk. Then a woman approached, young, maybe in her 20s. She held out a small American flag, the kind you get at elementary school assemblies or Veterans Day events. "I don't have the right words," she said, her voice trembling, "but I want to thank you." She handed the flag to Walter. He took it gently, nodded once, and rested it against his leg. Commander Briggs rose and turned toward the crowd. His voice was louder now, but not commanding. It was steady, honest. "You all watched a man fall today. Most of you didn't move. That's the truth. But now you've seen who he is. You've seen what he's given. Don't forget again." He didn't wait for applause. He simply walked back toward his men. Walter looked down at the flag, at the bench, at the cane resting against his knee. He wasn't thinking about the slap anymore. He wasn't thinking about humiliation. He was thinking about the next boy who'd walk this street in uniform, decades from now, and whether the town would remember how to treat him. Today, he thought, they remembered. But tomorrow would be the test. The man who had struck Walter Briggs was still standing outside Rosie's bar, but he no longer looked like the same man who had delivered that slap with a sneer and a laugh. His shoulders, once puffed with swagger, now sagged slightly under the gaze of every person in the street. The laughter he had bathed in earlier had dried up like a puddle in sunlight. His friends had taken quiet steps away from him, unwilling to be associated with what had become a moment of public disgrace. The biker's eyes darted from the line of veterans on the sidewalk to the Black Hawk still vibrating behind the buildings to the dozen soldiers in tactical black who stood without raising a voice yet commanded more presence than anyone he had ever met. He had slapped an old man. But not just any old man. And that realization was landing in his gut like a blow he hadn't prepared to take. Commander Briggs remained still, watching him from the center of the street. He didn't step forward. He didn't threaten. His silence was weight enough. One of his men, a soldier with a square jaw and a calm demeanor, stood a few feet to his left with his hand resting near his radio, eyes never leaving the biker. Another soldier glanced at the civilian crowd, his expression unreadable but resolute. They weren't posturing. They weren't angry. But they were ready. That kind of discipline wasn't something that could be taught overnight. It was the kind forged in fire, in training that demanded your body and your soul and then demanded more. The biker raised his hands in an attempt to justify himself. "Look, man," he said, his voice cracking under the pressure, "he bumped into my bike. That's all. I didn't know who he was. The words fell into the silence like pebbles dropped into a dry well. No echo. No reaction. He tried again. It was just a slap. It wasn't even that hard. I didn't mean. His voice trailed off when Commander Briggs took one slow step forward. Just one. But it was enough to silence him completely. Briggs spoke with a voice that carried across the street like steady thunder. You didn't need to know who he was to treat him like a man. You didn't need a history book or a citation list or a medal count. What you needed was basic human decency. And you failed. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They listened. Because something about that moment wasn't about spectacle. It was about truth. Briggs took another step forward. You struck a man who fixed tanks under fire, who pulled bodies out of burning wrecks, who stayed quiet not because he was weak, but because he understood that some strength doesn't require noise. He pointed toward the bench where Walter sat, still watching. That man wore a uniform before you knew how to ride a bicycle. He bled for people he never met, in countries you couldn't find on a map. And today, in your arrogance, you thought you saw an easy target. What you saw, he said, his voice cold now, was someone who didn't look like power. And that's where you failed again. Because you mistook silence for surrender. The biker swallowed hard. The smirk that had been glued to his face earlier was gone, replaced with something else, fear, maybe, or shame. He turned slightly, as if to walk away, but stopped when a police cruiser turned onto the block and rolled slowly to a stop. The officers exited without urgency. They didn't need to rush. The authority had already arrived long before they did. One of the soldiers stepped back, muttering something into his radio. Briggs nodded, then turned back to the officers and pointed. Just once. The officers approached the biker. This time, he didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't even ask why. He simply let them guide his arms behind his back and clip the cuffs into place. The metal clicked like punctuation. As they led him toward the cruiser, he kept his eyes down. The crowd parted like a wave, no one stepping forward to intervene or defend. A few people whispered. A woman near the diner pressed her hand over her mouth. A young boy on a bicycle stood frozen, his eyes wide and locked on the soldiers. Commander Briggs stepped aside, letting the officers pass. As the cruiser pulled away, the weight of the moment settled deeper into the street. Walter hadn't moved. He watched it all from his bench, the flag the young woman had handed him still resting gently on his lap. The cane remained between his knees, the grip worn and polished from years of use. But now, even seated, Walter looked like the tallest man on the block. Not because the town had changed him, but because it had finally been forced to see him for who he truly was. Briggs walked back to his father and sat beside him. He won't forget this, he said quietly. Walter didn't smile, but his eyes softened just enough to show he had heard. It's not about making him remember, he replied. It's about making the town remember. Briggs looked around. The crowd was still lingering, uncertain of what to do now that the adrenaline had worn off and reality had returned. People looked at Walter differently now. No longer just an old black man in a military jacket. No longer just a fixture on a bench. They looked at him the way you look at a monument you've passed every day but never bothered to read until someone tells you the story behind it. You've done more than they know, Briggs said. I've done what I could, Walter replied. What mattered? They sat together for a while in silence. No words were needed between them. The connection forged between father and son, soldier and commander, man and memory, didn't require conversation. It had already been spoken through action. Around them, the town began to breathe again. A woman crossed the street with her daughter, whispering something in her ear as they passed Walter. A teenage boy paused, turned around, and nodded toward Briggs before continuing on. Slowly, respectfully, the crowd began to disperse, not with gossip or excitement, but with a new weight in their hearts. Walter looked up at the sky. The Black Hawk still idled behind the stores, blades spinning, the air still charged. He wasn't sure how long it would stay or whether it even mattered now. What mattered was that for the first time in a very long time, he had not been pushed aside. He had not been ignored. And when someone tried to erase him, the world was made to see the truth. He wasn't just an old man. He was Walter Briggs. Sergeant. Father. Veteran. Witness. And the street that had watched him fall would now never forget the day he rose. The street held a different tone now. Gone was the hum of indifference that had hovered over Main Street earlier that morning, replaced by something that couldn't be named but was deeply felt. People walked more slowly, their steps measured, as if afraid to break whatever invisible spell had settled over the block. The wind, still brushed with the memory of the Black Hawk's blades, stirred napkins on the sidewalk and rippled through flags that had been motionless an hour before. Walter Briggs still sat on the bench, unmoved by the shift around him, yet entirely responsible for it. His presence had become a gravity the town could no longer ignore. And in that moment, he wasn't just a man on a bench, he was a symbol that had forced a community to see itself in a mirror. He leaned slightly on his cane, adjusting the weight on his hip with a grimace he didn't try to hide. The pain was real, a dull throb pulsing through his bones and joints, but it was easier to endure now that it meant something. Now that he wasn't bleeding in silence. The little flag still rested across his lap, a simple object transformed by meaning. Walter wasn't a man prone to ceremony, but he understood the power of symbols. And that small piece of cloth, handed to him by a stranger's daughter, had done more to stitch the town back together than any speech could have. Across the street, the Black Hawk's engines began to wind down. The thrum softened, the blades slowing, the tension in the air gradually releasing its hold. Soldiers remained in position, watchful but relaxed now. Commander Briggs stood nearby, his eyes scanning the crowd with that steady military stillness that made him seem taller than he was. His uniform didn't speak as loudly as the silence surrounding him, but every person who looked his way knew exactly who he was, not just a man of rank, but a man who had answered when it mattered. Walter exhaled deeply, watching a few curious children approach the line of veterans who still stood along the sidewalk. One boy, no older than 10, stepped forward and raised his hand in a salute. It was clumsy and a bit crooked, but sincere. One of the older veterans, a man with a thick mustache and a Navy emblem on his jacket, nodded and saluted back. The boy's eyes lit up like he'd just been knighted. His father stood behind him, one hand on the boy's shoulder, the other clutching a coffee cup that now trembled slightly. Walter saw it clearly, something had shifted in the father's eyes. Respect had rooted itself. That small act rippled through the gathering. Another child followed, then a teenager removed his headphones, stepping off his skateboard to stand near the line of veterans with his hands clasped in front of him. One by one, the crowd that had once turned away began to turn toward. A woman in her 40s, hair pulled back and face flushed with guilt, stepped toward Walter. She carried nothing in her hands, just the weight of a heart that had stayed too silent earlier. Her voice was soft, trembling, but clear. "I saw it happen. I saw everything. I should have done something. I'm sorry." Walter looked up at her, his eyes warm despite the pain etched deep in the lines around them. He didn't answer with words. He gave a single nod and the faintest smile, the kind that told her she had done something now, and that it mattered. Others came too, cautiously at first, but then in a quiet wave. A young barista from the diner brought a bottle of water and left it on the bench beside him with a whispered, "Thank you." A couple from the hardware store offered their apologies and said they'd be telling their son about him tonight at dinner. No one asked for selfies. No one treated it like a performance. This wasn't about social media or stories to tell later. It was about presence, raw and unfiltered. A town was learning how to respect again. Briggs returned to his father's side and sat beside him without a word. For a while, they said nothing, just watched the small moments unfolding around them, the kindnesses, the acknowledgments, the rebuilding. After a few minutes, Walter finally spoke, his voice gravelly but stronger than before. "They're not clapping," he said. "They shouldn't," Briggs replied. "Clapping's for concerts. This is about remembering." Walter gave a slow nod. "I can live with that." A group of high school students appeared at the edge of the street, led by a teacher who looked both overwhelmed and reverent. One of the girls stepped forward with her phone out, recording softly. Walter didn't mind. She wasn't pointing it at him. She was filming the row of veterans, the soldiers, the town beginning to come together. She was documenting a moment that would no doubt echo through morning announcements and social studies discussions for weeks to come. Walter watched her, then turned his gaze back toward the horizon. The wind had picked up again, lighter this time, less burdened. He felt it against his face and let it carry away the last remnants of the morning's sting. The Black Hawk began to lift, slowly rising back into the sky with a mechanical grace that silenced even the most distracted onlookers. It hovered above the field, then angled upward, carving through the clouds like a closing chapter. Walter didn't wave goodbye. He simply watched, his eyes reflecting the blades as they spun faster and faster before the helicopter disappeared into the sky. Commander Briggs stood again, brushing the dust from his knees. "You want me to stay a few more days?" he asked quietly. Walter shook his head. "No. You've done what you came to do." "You sure?" "I was seen today," Walter said. "That's more than I expected. More than most men like me ever get." Briggs looked at him, studying the lines in his father's face, the scar on his chin from a long-forgotten deployment, the resolve still set in his shoulders. "They won't forget," he said. "They better not," Walter replied, tapping the cane against the sidewalk. "Because next time, it might not be me sitting here." As the crowd continued to trickle away, some still lingering in hushed conversations, Walter remained seated. His body ached, but his spirit stood tall. He had waited for years without asking, without complaint. But today, for the first time in a long time, the world had stopped, turned around, and seen him clearly. Not as an inconvenience. Not as a relic. But as a man who had earned more than silence. And the sound of respect was louder than any applause. The wind blew softly down Main Street, carrying with it a strange stillness, the kind that settles only after something important has happened. The Black Hawk had lifted and vanished into the horizon, its rhythmic thrum now only an echo in memory. The soldiers had stepped back, standing quietly like silent sentinels, their duty shifting from action to reverence. But the most powerful sight on the street that day wasn't the helicopter, or the convoy, or even the commander, it was the line. The line of veterans. It had started with one man. A retired sailor with a weathered face, deep creases around his eyes, and a worn ball cap bearing the insignia of the USS Nimitz. He had stepped forward after the police cruiser pulled away with the biker in the back seat. Without a word, he had positioned himself at the edge of the sidewalk, facing Walter Briggs across the street. He'd stood at attention, not as a gesture of protest or pageantry, but out of deep-seated respect. He stood alone for a few seconds, until another man joined him, then another. The line grew, quietly and steadily, as more stepped out from the crowd. Some wore ball caps, others donned jackets with patches and pins from wars long past. One man walked slowly with a limp, assisted by a wooden cane carved with dates and unit numbers. A woman in an Air Force bomber jacket took her place without hesitation, her jaw clenched and eyes forward. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every one of them had seen what happened to Walter. And every one of them knew it could have been them. The slap may have landed on his face, but the insult had spread across generations, across uniforms, across every soldier who had ever returned home and felt like they no longer mattered. So they stood. Shoulder to shoulder. Spine straight. Eyes ahead. In silence. And the silence was more deafening than any anthem ever could be. Walter sat on the bench watching the line grow. He had seen many formations in his life, rows of soldiers at boot camp, columns of troops in the desert, rescue convoys under fire, but nothing had hit him quite like this. These weren't young soldiers in perfect posture. These were older men and women, some bent by time, some scarred by life, but all standing tall in this single act of solidarity. His chest tightened, not with pain, but with something he hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. People walking by began to stop. They didn't need an announcement or an explanation. They simply paused, lowered their voices, and stepped back. Children stopped bouncing balls. Phones dropped to people's sides. Even the birds quieted for a while, perching on lampposts as if they too understood that something sacred was unfolding. Inside Rosie's bar, the bartender leaned in the doorway, his face unreadable. He had been there when it all happened, and now he watched the line with a mix of awe and discomfort. The slap was just a spark. This was the fire. Commander Briggs stood off to the side, arms folded, eyes scanning the line with a kind of pride that went deeper than medals. He didn't orchestrate this. He didn't call these people here. They came because they knew. Because no one had to tell them what Walter Briggs represented. They had lived it. And now, standing side by side, they transformed the sidewalk into sacred ground. A young man in civilian clothes approached the line, hesitant. He couldn't have been older than 20. He wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and a faded camouflage backpack. He stopped near the edge of the formation and looked down the row of veterans. After a long pause, he slipped off his backpack, stood upright, and joined the line. He had never served. But his eyes were wet, and his posture was straight. Walter saw him, nodded slowly, and for the first time that day, felt something stir in the pit of his chest that hadn't been there in years: hope. The line didn't move. It held like a wall of memory, a barricade against forgetfulness. Every face in it told a different story. One man had tears in his eyes but didn't wipe them. Another gripped the dog tags hanging from his neck like a rosary. A woman near the center whispered something under her breath, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a name. The wind moved through them like breath through a pipe organ, rustling jackets and flapping flag pins against collars. It wasn't a protest. It was a proclamation. We are still here. We still matter. And we stand with one of our own. Walter slowly rose from the bench. His joints protested, but he ignored them. He placed one hand on the head of his cane, used it to lift himself upright, and stood facing the line. He didn't salute. He didn't speak. He simply stood. That was enough. One of the older veterans across the street, eyes gleaming with salt and time, raised his hand in a crisp salute. One by one, the rest followed. A wave of hands lifted to brows, to foreheads, to heart level. Not all of them got it perfect. Some were shaky. Some slow. But every single one was sincere. Walter held the moment in his chest like a lungful of air. He had been knocked down that morning. Bruised. Humiliated. Ignored. But now, he stood before a living wall of respect, and everything inside him that had been broken felt like it had been pieced back together by those salutes. They were offering more than acknowledgement. They were offering restoration. He lowered his head, not in defeat, but in gratitude. Then slowly, he raised his own hand in return. His salute was not sharp. It was not rehearsed. It was weathered, like him. But it carried more meaning than any words he could have spoken. The veterans held their salute for several seconds, and then, as if by silent command, they dropped their arms in unison. And in that instant, something shifted, not just in Walter, but in the entire town. A woman nearby whispered to her husband, "We forgot who we are." The man didn't reply. He didn't need to. Because now, with Walter standing tall and the line of veterans bearing witness, Main Street remembered. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The video began with a blur, someone's shaky hands trying to focus a phone camera on the scene across the street. The Black Hawk helicopter had already landed. Soldiers in black tactical gear had spread out, forming a perimeter around the bar and the line of veterans that had taken shape like a slow-moving wave. In the center of the frame was Walter Briggs, sitting calmly on a bench with a small American flag across his lap and a bruise on his cheek that spoke louder than any voice. The video had no music, no narrator, no edits. Just wind, breath, the steady whir of rotor blades, and the kind of silence that makes people lean forward instinctively. It lasted just under 4 minutes. But it didn't need to be longer. 4 minutes was all it took for everything to change. By nightfall, that video had reached a few hundred views, mostly shared by people in town who had been there, or knew someone who had. By midnight, it was in the thousands. A retired Marine from Alabama reposted it with a caption that read, "This is what honor looks like." Then a news anchor from Chicago tweeted it to her followers. Then a congressman from the Midwest. By the time the sun rose the next day, the number had crossed 1 million. And Walter Briggs, who had once passed through Main Street without a second glance from anyone, had become a national conversation. Local news vans showed up first. They parked near the diner and began broadcasting live, cutting into regular programming with headlines like, "Black Hawk lands on Main Street" and "Veteran assaulted, community responds in force." But the footage told the story better than any anchor could. Networks replayed the clip of Walter being helped to his feet by Commander Briggs, then the line of veterans raising their hands in slow, deliberate salutes. There was no need for commentary. The silence said it all. By mid-morning, national media descended. Reporters fanned out across the small town, pointing cameras at every angle of the block where it all unfolded. Some tried to knock on Walter's door, but he wasn't home. Others lingered near Rosie's bar, interviewing anyone who would speak. Most people offered short responses, some out of guilt, some out of pride. One woman, the same who had handed Walter the handkerchief the day before, gave a quiet interview on the steps of the church. "We all watched and did nothing," she said. "But we're watching now. We're not looking away this time." Back in his modest living room, Walter sat in his recliner with the television off. He didn't need to see it. He had lived it. What mattered to him wasn't the attention, or the headlines, or the flood of phone calls that had started coming in from journalists, politicians, and distant relatives. What mattered was what happened in those first few moments after the silence broke, the boy who saluted, the veterans who stood up, the woman who whispered an apology that weighed more than 1,000 tweets. He had never asked to be a symbol. But now that he was one, he felt a responsibility to hold it with the same care he gave to everything else in his life. Commander Briggs sat across from him, sipping coffee from an old chipped mug. He'd taken a leave of absence without being asked. No one questioned it. When a man like Briggs made a move like that, it spoke louder than paperwork. He was in civilian clothes now, though his bearing never changed. "They're calling you a hero," he said, setting the mug down on the coffee table. "Talking heads. Online articles. You name it." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Briggs nodded. "They've got headlines like, 'The Quiet Strength of Walter Briggs' and, 'When One Man Reminded Us Who We Are.'" Walter exhaled through his nose and looked out the window. The street outside was quiet again, but it didn't feel the same. "Funny thing about heroes," he said. "We only like them when they bleed quietly. The moment they make us look at ourselves, folks get uncomfortable." His son leaned forward. "You didn't ask for any of this." "No," Walter said. "But maybe it was time." He wasn't bitter. Not anymore. The ache in his hip still flared every time he moved, and the bruise on his cheek had darkened into something that would last a few more days, but the pain didn't own him. What lingered now was something deeper. A sense that maybe, finally, the world had paused long enough to listen. Not just to him, but to men and women like him who had carried the burden of silence for too long. That afternoon, the mayor called. Personally. She asked if Walter would attend a town meeting the following week where they planned to honor him publicly. She used words like resilience and dignity and representation of the best in us. Walter listened patiently, thanked her for the call, and said he'd think about it. He didn't need a podium. He didn't want a parade. But he understood the power of showing up. Sometimes, that was all it took to remind people what mattered. Later that evening, Walter walked to the diner. The booths were full, the bell above the door jingled brightly, and for the first time in a long time, everyone turned to look. But not with pity. Not with curiosity. With recognition. The waitress who had once looked away from the window now approached him directly. "Your table's open," she said, her voice softer than before. "It's always open for you." Walter nodded, took his seat, and ordered his usual, coffee, black, and a slice of rye with butter. Halfway through his meal, a young couple entered with their son. The boy was maybe 8, with wide eyes and a baseball cap too big for his head. He walked up to Walter's table and stood there nervously, twisting the hem of his shirt. Walter looked up and waited. Finally, the boy blurted, "Thank you for your service, sir." Then, in one quick motion, he saluted. Walter smiled gently, returned the salute with 2 fingers and said, "Thank you for seeing me." As the family left, the boy turned around and waved. Walter raised his cup in reply. That night, back at home, Walter finally turned on the TV. He flipped through channels until he landed on a national broadcast replaying the footage of that day. He watched the line of veterans again, the soldiers, the crowd shifting from apathy to awareness. And there he was, still on the bench, still quiet, still whole. He reached for the remote, turned the volume down, and let the image play in silence. Because that was how it all began. And sometimes, the loudest change starts when someone refuses to stay quiet. The town woke up the next morning not to the sound of traffic or church bells or the usual murmur of early risers, but to the weight of recognition. It wasn't loud. It wasn't proud. It was quiet, deliberate, like something old stirring awake after being forgotten too long. The storefronts looked the same, the lampposts still flickered with their soft orange glow, and the flag outside the post office still fluttered lazily in the wind. But under the surface, something fundamental had changed. People walked differently. They nodded at one another with more intent. They held doors a little longer. They looked others in the eye as if trying to remember how to be a community again. At town hall, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Calls poured in from state officials, local journalists, veterans organizations, and curious citizens from neighboring towns asking if the story was real, if the video had been edited, if the man in the bench was truly one of their own. The city clerk, who had worked there for nearly 20 years, said she hadn't seen this much interest since the mayor's first election, and even then, it wasn't this intense. The mayor, Annette Gillis, a middle-aged woman with a sharp mind and a sincere heart, cancelled her usual meetings and called for an emergency advisory session. She knew this wasn't something to sweep into a press release. This was a moment. The kind that either passed unnoticed or became a turning point. And she wasn't going to let it pass. That afternoon, city council members gathered in the chambers, some in person, others via video call. The atmosphere was thick with tension but not disagreement. No one debated whether Walter deserved recognition. That wasn't up for discussion. What they debated was how to do it right. A bronze plaque. A street renaming. A public ceremony. Each suggestion came with passionate arguments, but all carried the same undertone: this wasn't about damage control. It was about dignity. It was about admitting that they had looked the other way when it mattered most, and now, they had a chance to do what every good town should do: own their failure and transform it into something meaningful. Meanwhile, outside the chambers, the town itself moved with a strange combination of guilt and pride. Children walked to school holding hands with their grandparents. Teachers began their lessons with conversations about service, respect, and the importance of speaking up. At the barbershop, the usual banter about sports and weather shifted to quiet talk of Walter Briggs and what it meant to truly see someone. A mural artist from the edge of town started sketching a new piece on the side of a building, an image of an elderly black man in an army jacket sitting on a bench, not looking at the viewer, but gazing forward as though holding a secret. No title. No fanfare. Just truth in color and texture. At Rosie's bar, the mood had changed entirely. The biker crew had gone silent. Their leader had been formally charged with assault and released on bail, but his reputation was in tatters. No one spoke his name out loud. A few regulars who had laughed during the assault no longer showed their faces. The bartender, once passive and indifferent, had begun writing a letter. It wasn't to Walter. It was to the town. A confession, in his own hand, about what it felt like to witness a moment of cruelty and do nothing. He didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted the truth on paper. Back at Walter's home, the phone kept ringing. Reporters. Veterans. Politicians. Even a Hollywood producer had left a message about adapting the story for a feature-length film. Walter let most of the calls go to voicemail. He didn't need more attention. He needed quiet. He needed space to think. He sat by the window in the late afternoon, his cane leaning against the sill, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. He watched the kids riding their bikes down the street, watched an older couple walking their dog, watched the mailman tip his cap as he delivered the day's letters. Life was returning, but not quite as it was. There was more weight in every gesture now. More depth in each exchange. Commander Briggs joined him on the porch later that evening. He brought 2 bottles of soda, the kind they used to drink together when Briggs was just a teenager trying to grow into his father's boots. They didn't speak for a while. The sunset stretched across the sky in bands of gold and orange, casting long shadows across the quiet street. It wasn't the kind of scene people usually noticed. But tonight, it felt sacred. "Mayor called me," Briggs finally said. Walter raised an eyebrow. "They're planning something. A ceremony. A memorial. Maybe more." Walter took a sip of his soda, then set the bottle down on the wooden rail. "I don't want it if it's for them." Briggs nodded. "I told her that." "And what did she say?" "She said, if it's for him, we'll do it right." Walter looked out at the street again, his eyes heavy with thought. "Then maybe I'll show up. Just to see if they mean it." The following morning, flyers appeared across town. They weren't glossy or corporate-looking. They were simple, printed in black and white, with a single photo of Walter on the bench and the words, "We remember. We thank. We stand with." Below it was an invitation to a community event to be held on the town green that Saturday. No sponsors. No logos. Just the date, the time, and a simple request, "Come with open hearts." People took the flyers home. They posted them in windows. They taped them to lunchboxes and backpacks. Children asked their parents what it meant. Teenagers Googled Walter's name and sat quietly through the videos. Veterans who hadn't spoken in years began talking again. One man from 3 towns over called City Hall and said, "I want to shake his hand. Just once." Walter stayed quiet through it all. He didn't rehearse any speeches. He didn't prepare a statement. He just watched. He watched as the town that had once walked past him without a second glance now turned toward him as if reintroducing itself. The same sidewalks. The same storefronts. But no longer the same place. This was the beginning of a city's awakening. And Walter, for the first time in decades, didn't feel like he was just passing through. He felt like he was home. The sun broke through the clouds earlier than expected that Saturday morning, casting a soft light over the newly mowed grass of the town green. Dew sparkled across the field like a quiet celebration, glinting beneath rows of folding chairs that had been arranged in precise lines. A small wooden platform stood at the front, simple and unadorned, flanked by two flagpoles where the American and state flags fluttered in the breeze. There was no banner, no garish display of pageantry. Just a podium, a microphone, and the space where something important was about to happen. The air was hushed, respectful, charged with the kind of anticipation that makes people check their watches even when they already know what time it is. Walter Briggs had agreed to attend only after Commander Briggs promised him one thing: no parade, no fireworks, and no politicians trying to turn the moment into a campaign speech. It had to be for the people. More importantly, it had to be for the truth. Walter didn't want applause. He wanted acknowledgement. He didn't want gratitude in sound bites. He wanted the town to sit in its silence and listen. And so, with his son beside him and his cane resting at his feet, Walter arrived in a wheelchair pushed by a young volunteer who didn't say much but looked at him with wide, reverent eyes. As they approached the field, people began to rise from their seats, not in a choreographed queue, not because someone signaled them, but because it felt right. One by one, they stood, hats removed, hands clasped, conversations falling to a hush. The sound of hundreds of people standing together carried through the morning like the soft swell of a tide. Walter said nothing. He nodded to those he passed, his expression neutral but not cold. He didn't need to smile. His presence was enough. The crowd was a tapestry of the town itself, students in pressed shirts holding flags too big for their arms, elderly couples leaning on walkers, veterans in uniforms that no longer fit but still carried weight, children holding handmade signs that said things like, "Thank you Mr. Briggs," and "Our hero lives here." Local business owners stood in the back near the trees. The principal from the elementary school brought her choir, and the middle school band sat nervously beside the stage, clarinets glinting in the sunlight. Mayor Annette Gillis stood behind the podium. She wore a dark blazer and clutched a stack of papers that trembled slightly in her hands. She wasn't used to addressing a crowd this large. But she cleared her throat, stepped up to the microphone, and began. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying farther than expected in the open air. "Thank you for being here today. We gather not just to honor a man, but to reckon with what he represents. Walter Briggs is a veteran, yes. A mechanic, a father, a member of our community. But for too long, he was also someone we passed by without seeing. Until the day he reminded us what we should never forget." She paused, allowing the silence to settle. "This isn't a moment of celebration," she continued. "It's a moment of restoration. We can't change what happened. But we can decide what happens next." She looked toward Walter, who gave her the faintest nod. That was enough for her. The choir sang next, a simple rendition of "America the Beautiful," and for the first time, the words didn't feel like a formality. They hung in the air, fragile and sincere. A few voices cracked. A few hands trembled. Walter sat with his eyes closed during the song, letting it wash over him like a tide pulling him somewhere far back in memory. Then Commander Briggs stepped to the microphone. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. He looked out at the crowd with the posture of a soldier but the heart of a son. "My father didn't raise his voice," he began. "He didn't fight back. He didn't shout or demand attention. And that's what made what happened to him so powerful. Because when he was struck down, the silence that followed said more about us than him." He took a breath, his jaw tightening. "You see, my father taught me something I never learned in training. He taught me what strength looks like when it isn't loud. What honor looks like when it's worn thin and patched with age. What resilience feels like when no one is clapping." He looked at Walter. "Dad, you never asked for recognition. You never even asked to be remembered. But today, we remember. Not just you, but every man and woman like you who came home and quietly kept serving, in the way they lived, the way they walked, the way they refused to disappear." Walter's lips pressed into a tight line. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But his eyes told a story louder than any applause. As Commander Briggs stepped down, the middle school band began to play a slow, haunting version of "Taps." The notes drifted across the field like smoke, delicate and true. And when the last note faded, the mayor returned to the podium and motioned to a man standing beside the stage. He stepped forward carrying a cloth-covered plaque. With care, they unveiled it. It was bronze, mounted on a polished stone base. At the top, it read, "In honor of Sergeant Walter Briggs." Below that, etched deep into the metal, was a single sentence: "He stood when others turned away." People stepped forward one by one to see it. No rush. No pushing. Just reverence. Some placed flowers. Others whispered prayers. A few saluted. The line stretched long but moved slowly, deliberately, each step a quiet declaration: "I see you now." Walter sat still, taking it all in, the voices, the music, the wind, the faces. This wasn't just for him. It was for all the Thursdays he walked this town unseen. It was for every time someone crossed the street to avoid his eyes. It was for every veteran who had come home to silence instead of gratitude. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to thin, Walter looked at the plaque again. He didn't need to touch it. He didn't need to speak. It was enough to know it was there. The town had remembered. And this time, it wouldn't forget. The ceremony had ended, but the moment hadn't. Even as the folding chairs were collected and the last notes of the band drifted into memory, the energy lingered. The townspeople moved slowly, reluctant to leave the field as if walking away too quickly might undo what had just taken place. The plaque stood still at the center of the green like a new heartbeat planted in the town's chest. The words etched in bronze gleamed in the late morning sun. "He stood when others turned away." People passed by it like pilgrims, many pausing to run their fingers over the letters as though touching history. Walter Briggs remained seated just off to the side, his wheelchair still parked beneath the canopy of an old oak tree that had seen decades of change but perhaps nothing quite like this. He sat quietly, his eyes trained on the crowd with the patience of someone who had seen many things come and go, but had never expected this. He wasn't basking in praise. He wasn't reveling in honor. He was simply observing, taking it in, measuring what it all meant. Commander Briggs stood behind him, arms folded, expression unreadable. He had spoken in front of generals, briefed cabinet-level officials, and led men into hostile zones. But somehow, this moment felt larger. Because this wasn't about war. This wasn't about country. This was about his father. And the truth was, for all his medals and missions, this was the first time the world had looked at Walter and seen what he had always seen. The strong shoulders that had carried him through childhood. The quiet hands that had fixed engines and scraped knees with equal skill. The sharp eyes that had taught him how to read people long before he knew how to read books. The voice that had said so much without needing to speak loudly. The mayor returned to the podium one last time, her heels clicking gently against the wooden platform. She adjusted the microphone, cleared her throat, and then, instead of launching into another prepared statement, simply said, "Commander Briggs, would you like to close today's ceremony?" A pause fell over the crowd. All eyes turned. Commander Briggs blinked, caught off guard for the first time that morning. He glanced down at his father, who looked up at him and gave a small nod, not of encouragement, but of permission. Briggs inhaled, walked up the steps, and stood behind the podium, his tall frame casting a shadow over the microphone. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The wind rustled the nearby trees, and birds chirped lazily overhead, but otherwise, the world seemed to wait. He began without ceremony. "My father has always been my hero." But not in the way most people use that word. He didn't save a city or command a battalion. He didn't walk into burning buildings or land jets on carriers. My father was a mechanic. A soldier. A man who fixed what others broke. He didn't need to be seen to be valuable. He didn't need applause to matter. He just did the work. Quietly. Faithfully. Every single day. He looked toward Walter again. The crowd followed his gaze. There were days when I came home from training, exhausted, sore, doubting myself, and he'd be there in the garage, fixing a neighbor's lawn mower or tuning the old Buick that never really ran right. He wouldn't say much. Maybe just, tough day, or, pass me that wrench. But those small words carried more strength than anything I'd heard on base. He paused, swallowed. When I shipped out for my first tour, I found a note he had slipped into my gear. It just said, "You don't have to be loud to lead. Just be steady." I carried that note through sandstorms and firefights. And on the worst nights, when we were pinned down or outnumbered or scared out of our minds, I'd pull it out and remember where I came from. Remember who I came from. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. When he was assaulted on that sidewalk, the easy thing for him to do would have been to stay down. To let the world keep walking. But that's not who he is. He called me, not out of anger, but out of something deeper. A belief that we could still be better. That silence didn't have to win. And because of that call, something changed. Not just in this town. Not just in me. But in all of us. Commander Briggs looked out across the field now, his voice firmer. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight back. He didn't need to. Because dignity speaks louder than fists. Because respect doesn't have to shout. And because true strength, real, lasting, unshakable strength, sits quietly on a bench and waits for the world to catch up. He stepped back from the podium. There was no applause. Just stillness. Then, slowly, people began to stand again. This time not out of routine or expectation, but because the weight in the air demanded it. They rose one by one. Hands rested over hearts. Heads bowed. Walter looked at them, not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of calm that said he had finally seen the thing he never thought he would. Recognition. Commander Briggs walked back to his father, crouched beside the wheelchair, and took his hand. Walter didn't speak. He just held on. The kind of hold that said everything. The kind that made time slow down. Eventually, the crowd dispersed. People stopped by the plaque, shook hands with veterans, and hugged neighbors. Children chased one another around the edge of the field while parents kept watch. But no one forgot. Not this time. That night, back at home, Walter sat on his porch under the dim glow of the front light. Commander Briggs sat beside him, both sipping soda in silence. The stars above blinked in quiet witness. After a while, Briggs spoke. You taught them something today. Walter didn't look over. He just nodded. Maybe, he said softly. Or maybe they just remembered what mattered. And in that moment, under the stars, with no camera rolling, no crowd to watch, and no words left to say, Walter Briggs sat in the stillness he had always known. And for the first time, the world sat still with him. It arrived on a Tuesday, folded in half and wedged between a glossy catalog and an electric bill. The envelope was plain, off-white, no return address, no typed label, just Walter Briggs written in a shaky, uneven hand. Walter sat at the kitchen table, his reading glasses perched low on his nose as he sorted through the pile of mail with a methodical slowness that came from years of habit. He paused when he saw the envelope. Something about the handwriting felt familiar, though not in a comforting way. It was jagged, inconsistent, as if each letter had been dragged into existence against resistance. He set the rest of the mail aside and opened the envelope without ceremony. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, torn from a spiral-bound pad, the edges frayed with tiny curls of paper. The message was short. Just 6 words. If you'll meet me, I'll listen. Walter stared at the note for a long time. He didn't react right away. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the page, body still except for the slow rhythm of his breathing. His mind didn't race. It moved with precision, sorting through memory, tone, posture, the slurred voice behind the slap, the trembling silence afterward. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. He had seen men like that before, broken men, hiding behind anger, unsure how to ask for anything that didn't sound like a demand. He had been stationed with one in Kuwait, helped another off a bar floor in Georgia, and listened to a third cry behind a garage while pretending to fix a carburetor. They never said it directly. They always came with shame wrapped in stubbornness. But Walter had learned to hear what most people missed. He folded the letter and placed it on the table beside his coffee mug. Outside, the sun was beginning to warm the front porch, and a few leaves danced across the walkway in a dry shuffle. He looked out through the window, quiet. He could ignore the letter. He had every right to. No one would blame him. The man had humiliated him in public, struck him down in front of witnesses, made a mockery of his age, his service, his humanity. The country had seen it. The world had seen it. And the world had responded. But this letter wasn't from the world. It was from the one man who had never said a word when it counted most. Walter knew what it meant that he was trying now, even if clumsily. He reached for the phone. Commander Briggs answered on the second ring. Walter didn't waste time. I got a letter. His son's voice shifted instantly. From who? No name. But I know who it's from. Briggs didn't ask. He didn't need to. What does it say? Says if I'll meet him, he'll listen. There was silence on the other end. Do you want to? Walter looked back at the letter. I'm not sure. But I think I should. Then I'll arrange it. Quiet. No press. No uniforms. Walter nodded, more to himself than to the voice on the phone. Before the court date. Just us. Commander Briggs exhaled slowly. All right, Dad. I'll make it happen. 2 days later, Walter stepped into a small side room at the county courthouse. It was bare, no judge, no lawyers, just 2 chairs and a table between them. A deputy opened the door and gestured for him to enter. On the far side sat the man who had struck him. No sunglasses now. No leather vest. Just a plain button-down shirt, wrinkled at the sleeves, and jeans that hung awkwardly on his lanky frame. He looked older without the bravado. Smaller. His hands were clasped in front of him, knuckles white. His head was lowered, as if ashamed to meet Walter's eyes. Walter stepped in slowly, leaning on his cane, and took the seat across from him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The room hummed with fluorescent light and old tension. Finally, the man lifted his head, his eyes rimmed with red. I didn't know who you were, he said, voice low, not quite steady. Walter nodded slowly. That's the problem. You didn't care. The man winced. I grew up hating uniforms. My dad, he came back from Vietnam different. Mean. Angry all the time. I thought the war took him from me, so I took it out on every soldier I ever saw. Walter leaned back slightly. Your father didn't come back broken because of the war. He came back broken because no one helped him put himself back together. The man swallowed hard. I see that now. Or I'm trying to. Walter let that sit between them. Then he asked, what's your name? Kyle, the man said. Kyle Turner. Walter extended a hand slowly. Kyle hesitated, then reached out and shook it, his grip trembling. I didn't come here for an apology, Walter said. I came here to see if you meant what you wrote. Kyle pulled something from his back pocket and slid it across the table. It was a signed form from the court, agreeing to begin therapy, community service, and volunteer work at the VA center downtown. "I'm not doing it because they told me to," Kyle said. "I'm doing it because I've got to fix what's broken. In me. Around me." Walter studied the paper, then looked at Kyle. "It won't be fast. And it won't be easy." "I know." Walter nodded. "Then start with the next right thing. Then the next. And keep showing up." Kyle nodded, his eyes wet now, voice cracking. "I will." The meeting ended quietly. No handshake at the end. No sweeping gesture of closure. Just understanding. When Walter stood, Kyle stood too, as if rising in respect. Back outside, Commander Briggs waited by the curb. Walter climbed into the passenger seat, slowly, breathing deep. His son didn't ask how it went. He didn't have to. Walter looked out the window at the courthouse as they pulled away. "He's not a bad man," he said. "Just one who forgot how to be good." Briggs nodded. "Think he'll find it?" Walter considered that, then answered, "If he keeps showing up." The letter with no name had asked for a meeting. And what it got was a beginning. Thursday arrived quietly, the same way it always had for Walter Briggs. The sunrise slipped through the curtains in golden streaks, painting his kitchen table in light while the scent of brewing coffee mingled with the gentle crackle of his old radio. He moved slowly, carefully, joints a little stiffer than last week, but his mind sharp and aware. He folded his napkin, set out a clean handkerchief in his breast pocket, and checked the clock without ever really needing to. It was Thursday. And Thursdays belonged to him. This was the day he walked to the cafe. The same walk. The same pace. The same bench near the sidewalk in front of Donna's diner. It wasn't out of habit, it was a ritual, one that grounded him. For years, Walter had made this small pilgrimage not because he had to but because he chose to. It was his way of staying visible in a world that often overlooked people like him. But today, the walk would be different. He opened his front door and was greeted not by solitude but by anticipation. Across the street, a few neighbors nodded and smiled, real smiles, not the tight-lipped ones reserved for strangers. A group of school children on their way to the bus waved, and one of them shouted, "Hi, Mr. Briggs." The mailman paused his route and gave a sharp salute. Walter's step didn't change, but a warmth settled in his chest that hadn't been there before. The town had shifted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But perceptibly. And for once, Walter wasn't walking unseen. By the time he reached the diner, he noticed something else. The bench where he always sat was empty, but this time, it was freshly painted, a small plaque now embedded in the backrest. He bent slightly to read it. Reserved for those who served. Beneath that, in smaller letters, inspired by Walter Briggs. He touched the brass gently with his fingertips and let out a quiet breath. The world didn't change all at once, he knew. But this was a start. As he sat, Donna herself came bustling out from inside, apron dusted with flour and a carafe of hot coffee in her hand. "You're not paying for a single thing today, Mr. Briggs," she said with a playful wink. "And I don't want to hear no argument." Walter chuckled. "Wasn't planning to argue. Just here to enjoy a quiet morning." "You deserve it," she said, pouring him a fresh cup and setting it on the small table beside the bench. "And for the record, people have been asking about you all week. They're proud, you know." He gave a slight nod, stirring a packet of sugar into the coffee. "I'm not looking for pride. Just respect." "You've got it," she replied. "And not just here." As if on cue, a familiar figure emerged from around the corner, Kyle Turner, walking slowly, hands in his coat pockets, head slightly lowered but not in shame this time. Walter looked up and didn't move. Kyle approached with caution, pausing a few feet away. "Mind if I sit for a moment?" he asked. Walter gestured to the space beside him. Kyle sat down. They didn't speak at first. The noise of the town filled the silence, buses braking, birds overhead, the distant hum of conversation. It was a regular day, wrapped around a not-so-regular moment. Finally, Kyle turned slightly. I started volunteering last week. VA Center. Mondays and Wednesdays. Helping clean, organize records, deliver meals. Walter nodded but said nothing. And I met a man there, Vietnam vet. Name's Eddie. Lost both legs in '69. Told me I reminded him of someone he used to know. I think that was his way of telling me to shut up and listen. Walter smirked. Sounds like Eddie. Kyle chuckled softly. Yeah. He said you used to visit him, bring him tools to fix his old radio. I did. I asked him if he forgave the world for forgetting him. What did he say? Kyle looked down. Said he didn't need forgiveness. Just wanted to be remembered before it was too late. Walter's hands wrapped around his coffee cup. That's the hardest part. Outliving attention. They sat together for a while, the breeze moving lightly across the sidewalk. Then Kyle cleared his throat. I've been sober for 19 days. Doesn't sound like much, I know, but it's more than I've done in years. Walter looked over at him. It's enough. For today. Kyle nodded. I was thinking, maybe I could come by sometimes. Help out at the shop. Sweep. Change oil. Whatever needs doing. Walter considered that. You any good with your hands? Not yet. But I'm willing. That counts, Walter said. Show up Saturday morning. 8 sharp. Don't be late. Kyle smiled, a real one this time. Yes, sir. He stood, offered his hand, and Walter took it. No ceremony. Just an agreement between men who had seen the worst and decided to do better. As Kyle walked away, Walter turned his gaze back to the street. Cars passed. The town moved on. But something had shifted again. Not in headlines. Not in viral videos. But in that quiet, steady way that change sometimes happens. A man who had once shoved him to the ground now wanted to stand beside him. Walter took a sip of his coffee and leaned back against the newly painted bench. Across the street, a group of teenagers helped a veteran carry groceries to his car. The corner gas station had posted a new sign, veteran discount every day. Someone honked and waved. Walter nodded in return. It was Thursday. A day like any other. And yet, unlike any before it. He didn't need to be loud. He just had to keep showing up. Walter Briggs never cared much for headlines. He didn't trust the way they simplified truth into sound bites or filtered emotion through polished anchors with scripted sincerity. But ever since the footage of the Black Hawk incident went viral, his name had been carried across television screens and social media feeds like an unexpected wave crashing against the country's conscience. For a few weeks, he was the face of dignity standing against disrespect, of a veteran humbled and then lifted by the very community that had once walked past him in silence. What surprised Walter wasn't that people noticed. He'd lived long enough to know public outrage came in waves. It was what happened after that truly stirred something deep inside him. The first letter came from Missouri. A young woman who had never served but whose grandfather had died before she was born. She had always felt distant from his legacy, unsure of how to connect with the uniform in the faded photos. But after watching the video of Walter sitting calmly, the chaos erupting around him, and the storm of justice that followed, she wrote to say she finally understood. Not just her grandfather, but the kind of strength that didn't shout. Then came the letter from Maine. A retired firefighter who'd lost his best friend in Afghanistan. The man confessed he'd stopped believing in symbols, in the power of uniform, in the goodness of memory. But after seeing how Walter handled humiliation, not with fists, but with unshakable stillness, he said he cried for the first time in 10 years. That letter included a photo of the friend's boots, now kept on a mantel beneath an American flag. Dozens turned into hundreds. Some short, others long. Some typed, others scrawled in crayon by children who didn't fully understand but knew that Walter Briggs had done something important. Walter read each one. Slowly. Carefully. He didn't skim. He treated each envelope like it held something fragile because, to him, it did. People's truths. Their regrets. Their attempts to say something they hadn't said before. Commander Briggs had come over the day the third mailbag arrived. He walked into the living room, arms full of envelopes, eyebrows raised. "This one's from Germany," he said, holding it up. "U.S. Army base. Looks like you've got fans overseas." Walter set down his glasses and leaned back in his recliner. "I didn't do anything special." "You did," his son replied. "You endured. And then you stood back up." Walter gave a soft chuckle. "With help from a helicopter." The commander smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "That's not why they wrote. They're not writing about the Black Hawk. They're writing about the look on your face. The way you didn't flinch. The way you never raised your voice. That's what they remember." Walter nodded slowly. "Funny, isn't it? I lived most of my life trying not to draw attention. And now strangers are calling me a symbol." Commander Briggs lowered his voice. "You are one. Whether you wanted to be or not." Later that week, the mayor invited Walter to speak at a local high school. At first, he refused. "I'm no speaker," he said. "I fix carburetors and sweep driveways. Kids these days don't want to hear about oil changes and trench boots." But after some gentle pressure from Donna and even a call from Pastor Ellis, he agreed. "Just once," he said. "Just this one time." When Walter walked into the school auditorium, he expected polite boredom. He expected forced claps and wandering eyes. But what he found was an audience on its feet. Not clapping. Not cheering. Just standing. Silent. Respectful. Waiting. He shuffled to the podium, cleared his throat, and looked out at a sea of young faces. He didn't read from a script. He didn't need to. "I'm not here to tell you how to live," he began. "I'm just here to tell you what I've seen." He spoke of service, not just military, but service to others. He talked about the power of listening, about how easy it is to pass judgment without context, to see only what's on the surface and never what lies beneath. He spoke of how respect isn't owed, it's earned, and how sometimes, it's restored by one act of courage, even if that courage is just sitting still when the world expects you to crumble. When he finished, the silence that followed was heavy, not awkward. A teacher in the front row wiped her eyes. A football player in the back stood straighter. And then the room filled with applause, not the explosive, performative kind, but the deep, sustained kind that comes from hearts moved, not just minds impressed. That night, Walter sat on his porch again, the sky painted in twilight, letters stacked neatly beside him on a folding table. Commander Briggs leaned against the railing, a soda in hand, staring out into the quiet street. "You're changing things," he said. "People are starting to ask questions they never asked before." "Questions are good," Walter replied. "Questions mean they're thinking. They're also organizing," the commander added. "Veteran groups, students, even some politicians. They're asking how we treat our elders. How we educate kids on what service means. I think we've started something." Walter didn't say anything for a while. Then he looked up at the stars. "I didn't plan any of this. I just got knocked down." And stood back up, his son added. Walter chuckled. That part was optional. They both laughed, the easy laughter of men who had walked through fire and come out whole. The ripple had started with a slap. It had grown into a roar. But now, it was moving deeper, settling into places where change really began. Not on screens. Not in headlines. But in hearts. In homes. In the quiet places where stories sink in and live on. And Walter Briggs, the man who never sought attention, now understood something profound. Sometimes, it's not the storm that changes the world. Sometimes, it's the one who sits still through it. The sign went up one morning under a pale autumn sky, anchored in fresh soil, framed by the trimmed hedges of a once-forgotten public park. Walter Briggs hadn't been told the full plan. He'd only received a formal invitation with gold lettering and an official seal, asking him to attend a community dedication ceremony at Riverside Park. He nearly threw it out, thinking it was one of those things where someone got up and talked too long, and they handed out plaques no one really remembered. But when Commander Briggs called to say he'd be in town that morning, Walter felt the tug of curiosity stronger than his usual resistance to formality. The morning air was crisp, the sun hanging low like a watchful witness as Walter arrived in his Sunday best, walking cane in hand, dress shoes polished but well worn. He approached slowly, noting the unusual crowd gathered near the old gazebo. School children in clean uniforms, veterans in their caps and jackets, town officials lined up in suits, and news cameras with blinking red lights. Something was different. Something was waiting. A path of white chairs led to a small stage framed with bunting and a podium. The mayor stood there, fidgeting with her speech papers, until someone whispered something in her ear and she turned, catching sight of Walter. She immediately stepped down and met him halfway. "Mr. Briggs," she said with warmth, "thank you for coming." Walter nodded slightly, already uncomfortable with the attention. "Wasn't planning to speak." She smiled. "You don't have to. But I think you'll want to stay." He took a seat near the front, Commander Briggs sitting beside him, eyes scanning the crowd like the soldier he always was. There was a strange silence, expectant, reverent, and then the mayor returned to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and solemn, "we are gathered here today to recognize a man who reminded us that valor isn't always loud, and dignity doesn't come dressed for applause. A man who showed that courage sometimes sits quietly on a bench while the world spins too fast to see it. That man is Mr. Walter Briggs." The crowd stood. All of them. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't prompted. It was real. A standing recognition not just of what Walter had endured, but of what he had embodied. Walter didn't move. He simply bowed his head for a second, eyes misting behind his glasses. The mayor turned to the covered sign. "This park has served our town for nearly 70 years, but it has never had a name. Today, we change that. From this day forward, Riverside Park will be known as Briggs Field, in honor of a man whose quiet strength gave us a reason to remember." She pulled the cloth from the sign, revealing bold letters etched into a polished stone slab, "Briggs Field, in honor of Walter Briggs, veteran, neighbor, example." Underneath, a simple line read, "Sometimes standing still is the bravest thing a man can do." The applause that followed was thunderous. Children clapped with both hands in the air, veterans wiped tears, even the camera crews lowered their lenses for a moment as if not wanting to interrupt the purity of the moment. Walter didn't stand. He didn't need to. The honor sat with him like a well-worn coat, one he had carried through heat and cold and still never took off. Afterward, a small boy approached him, holding a hand-drawn picture of a Black Hawk helicopter with a stick figure labeled, "Mr. Briggs." He handed it to Walter without a word, just a smile, and Walter took it gently, tucking it into his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That's better than any medal I ever got." Later that afternoon, the park came to life like it hadn't in decades. Children played near the fountains, teenagers set up a soccer game, and at the far end, a group of young veterans helped plant a new row of trees. At the base of each tree was a small plaque with a veteran's name, many unknown, but not forgotten. Walter walked past each one slowly, reading names he'd never heard aloud, honoring them with his silence. Commander Briggs walked beside him, hands in his pockets. "You ever think it would come to this?" his son asked. Walter shook his head. "No. I thought I'd leave this world like I entered it, quiet, unnoticed. But instead, you left a legacy." Walter stopped, looking out over the field, now alive with laughter, with memory, with presence. "I didn't create anything. I just refused to disappear." His son looked at him and nodded. That was enough. They returned to the bench, the same kind of bench where it had all begun, but this one was placed beneath an old oak tree that had stood longer than the town itself. Walter sat, the weight of years resting easy on his shoulders now. He looked out at Briggs Field, not as a tribute, but as proof that even the smallest acts can ripple outward into change. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent, Walter remained on the bench. People came and went. Some shook his hand, others just nodded. He welcomed them all with the same grace. A girl in a wheelchair asked if she could sit beside him. He said of course. She didn't speak, but after a while, she reached over and held his hand. He didn't ask her name. She didn't need to explain. As dusk fell, the field grew quieter. The last rays of light caught the edge of the polished sign. And for the first time in his life, Walter Briggs allowed himself to believe that perhaps a man didn't need to change the world to be remembered. He just needed to hold the line, even when no one was looking. That was his service. That was his protest. That was his victory. It had been a year since the slap heard round the world. A year since a biker's cruelty collided with a veteran's quiet strength and set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. And in that year, Walter Briggs had become something he never set out to be, a living monument, not of war or heroism, but of restraint, integrity, and resilience. He still woke before dawn each day, still brewed his coffee with exact measurements, and still polished his boots even when he wasn't going anywhere. Some things don't change, and for Walter, the rhythm of order brought a calm he had earned the hard way. But now, every Thursday brought something new. New letters. New visitors. New students coming to shake his hand. People driving in from out of state just to sit with him, listen, and sometimes cry. He didn't have answers for most of them. He just had presence. That was enough. Today was a Thursday too. But it didn't feel ordinary. There was a weight in the air, not of dread, but of something sacred. Walter stood in his small living room, carefully adjusting his tie in the mirror. It was black, pressed, and smooth, the one he wore for weddings, memorials, and days that required reverence. The brass pin of his old unit gleamed from his lapel. His cane leaned against the couch, waiting patiently. On the table sat a folded flag. Not his, at least not yet. It had been presented to him by a widow who said her husband would have wanted a man like Walter to keep it. He never asked why. He just said thank you and kept it folded with precision. Commander Briggs knocked on the door right at 8. He was dressed sharply too, metals shining faintly under the porch light. Walter opened the door, nodded once, and stepped outside without a word. The ride to Briggs Field was quiet. They didn't talk much these days, not because there was nothing left to say, but because so much had already been said that silence had become its own language between them. The car turned the final corner and pulled into the newly paved lot. Even from a distance, Walter could see the crowd. More than last time. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. People lined the paths of the park, waving small flags, holding flowers, holding signs that said things like, "We remember because of you," and, "Still standing." When the crowd began to thin, and the sun dipped low in the horizon, Commander Briggs returned with 2 cups of coffee from Donna's diner. He handed one to his father and sat beside him. They watched the evening settle in, golden light painting the memorial, the trees, the faces of those still lingering in quiet reverence. "You ever think it would end like this?" the commander asked. Walter sipped his coffee. Didn't think much about the end. Just thought about getting through. His son smiled. Well, you did more than that. Walter looked out over the field. The grass was neatly trimmed. Children were playing on the other side. A group of young cadets were raising the flag again for evening colors. I guess I did, he said. They sat in peace, the air cooling but not cold, the world continuing on around them. And in that moment, Walter Briggs knew that legacy wasn't measured by medals or monuments, but by the lives you touch and the dignity you protect. He hadn't gone looking for recognition. He hadn't chased honor. But by holding the line with grace and quiet strength, the world had come to stand beside him. And so he kept his watch. One last time. Not for glory. Not for pride. But for every soul who ever needed to believe that one man, even sitting alone on a bench, could remind a weary world how to stand tall. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?